so that I make sure that I'm recording. All right, so we left off looking at thyroid hormones, which were T3 and T4, and we're going to talk a little bit about how they differ coming up. Some of the effects of thyroid hormone were calorigenic in their nature. So increasing the rate of our sodium potassium pumps, the rate of ATP production and consumption, and the rate of enzyme production that are responsible for glycolysis, glycogenolysis, etc. So really, thyroid hormone is a metabolic hormone. It's going to speed up our metabolic rate. So what we'll look at now is an example of thyroid hormone and the axis of thyroid hormone. We talked about the feedback loops that are included here, and how some of the tertiary hormones can go back and negatively impact the hypothalamic hormones and the pituitary hormones. So let's draw out or illustrate here what the thyroid hormone axis looks like. Now, this axis is going to hold true for all the other hormones that we'll look at. Cortisol, for example, and ACTH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and testosterone and progesterone. So the axis is going to be similar, but we're going to draw it out and illustrate it here for thyroid hormone. So let's start by looking at the hypothalamus in the brain. This is the location of the initial component of this hormone axis. So here's our hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus, by way of the infundibulum, connects down to the pituitary as well. So up here is where we have the hypothalamus. And then down here is where we have the two parts of the pituitary. Here's the anterior pituitary. And then the smaller posterior pituitary. So remember, we spoke about the portal system, which is the route by which hormones picked up here in the hypothalamus can make their way down to the posterior pituitary. We also spoke about the posterior pituitary and how that differed altogether, in that the axons that are in the hypothalamus project down to the posterior pituitary. So just bear those things in mind as we talk about the connection between hypothalamus and pituitary. How are these hormones being transported from one place to the other? So in the hypothalamus, the hormone that's released here, the trophic hormone that's released here, is called TRH, which stands for thyrotropin releasing hormone. That is going to stimulate the production of TSH. Okay, so let's draw that initial axis happening here. So TRH, and I'm going to draw this in green just to represent that it is a stimulatory hormone, is going to stimulate the production of TSH from the anterior pituitary. All right, so now the anterior pituitary is going to release its TSH. And just to remind ourselves here, the route by which this is happening is the portal circulation. So let's just make a note of that, the portal circulation. All right, now TSH is also going to have its own role in stimulating the thyroid gland itself. So let's draw that axis. So this is going to stimulate the thyroid gland itself. To make its own T3 and T4. And we talked about exactly how this happens. TSH has to bind onto that receptor on the thyroid follicular cell membrane, and then it's going to have a second messenger effect in the cell, which is going to result in uptake of thyroglobulin, which is that storage form, and then that can be converted into active forms, which are T3, T4, and that is released out into the blood. So that's the mechanism that we described earlier, and this is exactly where it's happening as far as this entire axis. So T3, T4 is released. Now I want to make a note here that there's excess of T4. So the excess release is really for T4. There's more T4 released as compared to T3. Now, if we think about the effect of thyroid hormone, which we, again, just described, having that calorogenic effect, it's going to have its effect on things like liver cells, kidney cells, and general body cells, so muscle cells. So that's going to be the fourth component in our axis here. So let's draw those organs in. So our peripheral organs, such as liver, right? Here's our large liver, our kidneys, and then other body cells, right? This will include muscle, etc. And so the T3, T4 that's released from the thyroid gland will enter the bloodstream, and it will encourage the metabolic weight, etc., of these organs. So that T3, T4 is released, and it is going to stimulate a certain response on our general body cells, liver and kidney included. So these are the things that we're talking about: increase of the sodium potassium pump rate, increase in the amount of enzymes required for glycolysis and cellular respiration, increase in the number of mitochondria in muscle cells, for example. These are the peripheral effects that thyroid hormone have. Now let's talk about the feedback loops, how this process can be regulated. If there is conversion, so there's conversion of T4 to T3 in our peripheral tissues, okay? So excess T4 is secreted, and T4 specifically can have a negative feedback onto the pituitary as well as the hypothalamus. So the short feedback loop is when TSH, trying to figure out the best place to draw this. Let's do it here. So TSH release can go back up to the hypothalamus and negatively affect TRH release. This is called a short negative feedback loop. A short negative feedback loop. Okay. Now the long negative feedback loop is going to be when T4 levels, okay, so T4 levels also go back up to the hypothalamus and negatively impact TRH as well. Okay, so this is for T4. This is called a long negative feedback loop. Okay. So this is the importance of having T3 versus T4. T4 is going to be more active in the peripheral tissues. And when we say peripheral tissues, we mean these tissues over here. T4, on the other hand, is going to be more so involved in the negative feedback loop. And so converting T3 to T4 is going to be a way to signal that there's excess T3 levels. And so we need to shut off this axis from the level of the hypothalamus. And so we convert T3 to T4, and then T4 can have that negative feedback to decrease the total amount of TRH, TSH, and then subsequently thyroid hormone. So let's just make a note here that T4 is more actively involved in the negative feedback. Okay, and let's also make a note here that the effect on our peripheral tissues is increase the calorogenic effect. Right, so we can see here how having excess levels of thyroid hormone can lead to some of the clinical symptoms and signs that we see in patients with hyperthyroidism, right? If we're increasing some of these effects here with excess T3, T4, then these patients are going to be, like we said, anxious, more nervous, excess weight loss, increased sweating, all those types of symptoms which are coming from the excess calorogenic effect. All right. Any questions on this so far? Any questions? Okay, I'm going to give another minute just in case you are finishing up, and then we'll continue on. All right, and I'll post these drawings later on, so no need to worry if you miss anything. Let's keep going here. So the other component within the thyroid region that we want to think about is parathyroid hormone, which is coming from the parathyroid glands. Now, this is entirely different from the thyroid hormone. This is entirely different tissue. It just happens to be embedded within the gland itself. So here are the 4 parathyroid glands. Notice that they're in the posterior surface of the thyroid gland itself, and they're separated by a membrane. So the cells are completely different, and they have different hormone components or hormones being released. Parathyroid hormone, which is coming from the glands, is going to help regulate calcium levels in the blood. So we spoke about this idea that the blood calcium levels can be regulated in terms of how much of that calcium is in the bones versus how much is stored in the, or released rather, in the blood. And so parathyroid hormone is going to help take calcium from the bones and deposit it into the blood. As such, it's going to regulate calcium levels. We'll talk about calcitonin, which is the opposite hormone. Calcitonin is going to take calcium from the blood and deposit it into the bone. So parathyroid hormone goes from bone to blood, and calcitonin is going to take it from the blood and deposit it or store it in the bones. All right, moving on to the 5th lecture objective, describe the effects of glucocorticoids on whole body metabolism, compare the physiological effects of glucocorticoids to their pharmacological effects. So really talking about steroids, and this is going to now focus on the adrenal axis. Now, the hormones of the adrenal gland are adrenocorticoids. There are 3 different types. Mineralocorticoids, which is aldosterone, that's going to regulate our sodium and potassium levels. It's going to have an effect on the kidney in terms of how much of that sodium is reabsorbed and how much of that potassium is secreted or wasted. Glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol, is going to regulate the body's response to stress. Glucocorticoids are often called the body's stress hormones. They are released in response to stressful environmental situations. And when we say stress here, we don't just mean physical stress, but it can be physiologic stress as well. If you have an infection going on, if there's any type of tumor or cancer, those are all stressful events to the body, as well as more physical stress being exerted on the body, such as exercise, and also mental stress, right? So if there's an emotional response happening, that can be considered stress as well. So physical, physiologic, and mental stress can all result in cortisol secretion. Cortisol is also going to regulate the metabolism. So it's going to decrease our ability to use glucose appropriately. This is why we typically gain weight when there's excess cortisol involved. And then the third category of adrenocorticoids is sex hormones. These are androgens, and they play a role in reproductive function, especially in males. Androgens are going to be an important part of the male reproductive cycle. Now, to identify exactly where these hormones are being secreted, we talked about the adrenal gland as far as the medulla in our previous topic in the autonomic nervous system. So this is the inner part of the gland. And remember, the adrenal is on top of the kidneys. It's that small mass of tissue that is on top of the kidneys. The inner portion is the medulla secreting norepinephrine and epinephrine, specifically the chromaffin cells here. The outer part of the gland is the cortex. So it's a lighter staining region of the gland, and that is where we have the adrenocorticoids being secreted. Each layer of the cortex will secrete one of these hormones. So we have the aldosterone layer, the glucocorticoids layer, and then the androgen layers in that order. Okay, so I won't go over this. We just talked about this. The adrenal medulla inside is what's secreting the autonomic hormones that we talked about before. I do want to point out here, this is also under neural control. So the preganglionic neurons from the sympathetic side of the autonomic nervous system synapse here onto the chromaffin cells, and then they will release their secretions. Let's look at each of the hormones in terms of their function. Glucocorticoids, mainly cortisol, is the hormone of stress. It's regulated through the CRH-ACTH axis. So the axis that we just illustrated for thyroid hormone involving hypothalamus, anterior pituitary, and then the thyroid gland itself, a similar axis can be drawn for ACTH, CRH, and cortisol released from the adrenal cortex. So think about that axis. We're not going to draw it out here in the interest of time, but that similar flow of events happens as far as cortisol is concerned, and the feedback loops are also at play in that axis as well. So CRH can shut off, or ACTH rather, can have a negative feedback onto CRH as a short loop, and then cortisol can have a negative feedback onto CRH as a long feedback loop. Some of the other functions associated are mobilizing energy stores, suppressing the immune response. This is why we typically give patients who have autoimmune disorders or are in the middle of an infection or have a decreased immune response associated with a cancer or a tumor growth. We typically give these patients steroids as a way to suppress the immune response and help these patients alleviate some of the symptoms. If you think about an autoimmune condition, it's overactivity or hyperactivity of the immune system to where your immune system is sort of killing or attacking your own body cells. So glucocorticoids is one of the ways to alleviate that. Other roles of cortisol in terms of the stress response include just increased cortisol secretion, increase of the sympathetic activity, so more of that fight, flight, freeze response, increase in epinephrine as a way to bring that about, increase in ADH release, which is going to prevent diuresis or prevent water loss and sodium loss, increase in angiotensin II, which will have a similar effect. And we'll talk more about these things when we look at the kidneys in detail. The fight or flight response, which is helping to mobilize energy stores, increase or maintain blood pressure as well. So hyperactivity of the autonomic nervous system, and then hyperactivity in terms of water reabsorption, sodium reabsorption.